Victor Hale didn't knock. He never knocked. He shoved the door of Caleb Thorne's blacksmith shop open so hard it cracked against the stone wall, and every man inside flinched. Every man except Caleb, who stood at his forge with a hammer in his hand and didn't turn around. "I want you out by Friday," Victor said. He wasn't even looking at Caleb. He was looking at the walls, the tools, the bellows, the way a man looks at something that already belongs to him. "I'll give you $400, and you can take that ugly dog with you." Someone laughed from behind Victor, one of his men. Caleb set his hammer down, slowly. Then he turned. "Get out of my shop." Victor smiled the smile of a man who had never once been told no and believed it. If you've ever been written off before anyone knew your name, if you've ever walked into a room and watched people move away, then stay with this story. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what comes next, and drop a like while you're here. Tell me in the comments what city or country you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's begin. The town of Raven Creek, Colorado, sat at an elevation that punished you for living there. The wind came off the mountains mean and personal, like it had a score to settle, and by October the mud on Main Street froze into ruts that could throw a horse and snap its leg clean. It was not a pretty town. It was a working town, the kind built by men who didn't have the luxury of choosing somewhere nicer, and it wore that fact openly. In the warped timber of its storefronts, in the way the saloon sign had lost 2 letters and nobody bothered replacing them, in the coal smoke that hung over the rooftops every morning like something the town couldn't exhale. Caleb Thorne had lived in Raven Creek for 11 years, and in that time he had shod more horses than he could count, repaired wagon axles and plow blades and rifle barrels, and built the iron hinges on nearly every door on the main street. He knew this town the way a man knows a bad habit, completely and without illusion. He also knew that most of the people in it would cross the street rather than walk past him. The accident had happened 8 years ago in the Garfield mine 3 miles east of town. Caleb had gone in to pull a man out after a shaft collapse, and the lantern chain caught on something in the dark. And then there was fire. And then there was nothing for a long time. When he woke up in the company doctor's back room, he couldn't see out of his right eye for 3 weeks. The eye came back eventually. The left side of his face did not. The scarring ran from his jaw to his temple, thick and ridged, pulling the corner of his mouth into a permanent expression that people read as a sneer. His left ear was partially gone. The skin on his neck and left shoulder was grafted and uneven. He had looked at himself in a mirror exactly twice since the accident and decided that was enough times. He did not think of himself as a monster. He thought of himself as a man who had been burned and had lived, which seemed to him a straightforward fact. But Raven Creek did not deal in straightforward facts when a more dramatic interpretation was available, and so Caleb Thorne became the story parents told their children to make them behave, and the reason women walked on the far side of the road, and the figure that newcomers to town were warned about before they'd even unpacked their trunks. He had a dog named Biscuit, who was 15 years old, arthritic, and mostly deaf. And Biscuit slept on an old saddle blanket near the forge, and didn't care what Caleb's face looked like. That was the whole of Caleb's social life, and for a long time he told himself it was enough. It wasn't enough. He realized it on a Tuesday evening in late September when he sat down at the table to eat supper and caught himself setting 2 plates out of habit, though there had never been anyone to eat with. He stood there looking at the second plate for a long time. Then he put it back in the cupboard. Then he sat down and ate his beans in silence while Biscuit wheezed on the blanket across the room, and the wind pushed against the cabin walls like it was trying to get in, and the silence was so complete and so heavy that Caleb felt it pressing on his chest like a hand. He was 39 years old. He had a trade, a property, a working forge, and a dog. He did not have a single person in the world who would notice, in any immediate sense, if he did not wake up tomorrow. He sat with that thought for several days before he did anything about it. The advertisement took him 4 drafts to write. He was not a man who struggled with words in ordinary conversation. He was blunt and direct, and people either appreciated that or they didn't. But writing it down felt different. It felt like handing a stranger a map to somewhere private. The final version read, "Blacksmith, age 39, Raven Creek, Colorado. Own property and steady trade. Seeking woman of good character willing to relocate. Must be warned. I carry scars from an accident years past, and my face will not be what most women hope for. I am not a gentle-looking man, but I am an honest one, and I will treat a wife with respect. Write to C. Thorne, General Delivery, Raven Creek. He read it back twice, decided it was accurate, if not flattering, and mailed it to 3 newspapers. One in Kansas City, one in St. Louis, one in Cincinnati. Then he went back to work and tried not to think about it. The letters started arriving 6 weeks later. There were 11 of them. 7 he set aside immediately. He could tell from the handwriting and the phrasing that the women had responded to the property more than to the man, and Caleb had no interest in being someone's practical solution. 2 seemed genuine but asked questions that made him uneasy. Things about whether his condition was contagious, whether he could still work, whether the scars affected his mind. He understood the questions. He didn't want to answer them. The 10th letter was from a widow in Kansas who wrote with crisp efficiency and mentioned 3 times that she was a hard worker. He wrote back once, she wrote back once, and then the correspondence died of its own accord, which he figured was the answer. The 11th letter arrived separately, a week after the others, as if it had taken longer to gather the nerve to travel. The handwriting was careful, but not pretty, the kind of handwriting that suggested someone who had learned to write late or had learned under difficult circumstances, pressing too hard on the pen because they wanted to get it right. The paper was plain. There was no perfume. It began without preamble. Mr. Thorne. My name is Evelyn Hart. I am 34 years old, unmarried, and I live in Cincinnati, Ohio, where I work in a laundry. I read your advertisement, and I want to be honest with you the same way you were honest in the advertisement itself. I am a large woman. I have been told my whole life that I am too big, too plain, and too much. I have been passed over for positions because of how I look, and I have been laughed at publicly more times than I want to count. I am not writing to tell you about my suffering. I am writing because I read your advertisement and recognize something in it. You warned women away from you before they'd even met you. I thought about that. Then I thought about how many times someone decided about me before they knew me, and how much I hate that. I am good with figures and with managing household accounts. I can cook and I can clean and I can work very hard. I am not sure what else to say. I don't know if you'd find me suitable, but I thought if anyone might give me an honest chance, it might be a man who asked for the same thing himself. Evelyn Hart. Caleb read the letter twice in the shop and once more after supper. He sat with it for 2 days before he wrote back. He wrote, Miss Hart, your letter was the most honest thing I've read in a long time. I have no objection to a large woman. I have objections to dishonesty and to cruelty, and your letter contained neither. If you are willing, I would like to continue writing. They exchanged 7 letters over the following 8 weeks. He told her about the forge, about Biscuit, about the accident, the real version, not the shortened one he gave the few people in town who asked. She told him about the laundry, about the family she'd grown up in that made her feel like a problem to be solved, about a man named Gerald who had courted her for 5 months and then married her younger sister instead, while Evelyn was still expecting a proposal. She didn't tell that story with bitterness. She told it with a kind of flat, tired honesty that Caleb found more affecting than anger would have been. In the 6th letter, she asked, Do you think 2 people can start over? Or do you think who you've been follows you everywhere? He sat on that question for 3 days. He wrote back, I don't know. I think some things follow you no matter what, but I think what you do with them can change. I'm not the same man I was before the accident, but I don't think that's all bad. I'm less patient with nonsense. I know what matters more clearly. Whether that's starting over or just continuing with better information, I can't say. She wrote back in 4 days, which was faster than usual. That's the most sensible thing anyone has said to me in years. In the 7th letter, she asked if he'd still have her, and he wrote back that he would, and she arrived on a Thursday afternoon in late November on the southbound train with a large trunk, a smaller bag, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision and intended to stand by it, even if her hands were shaking. Caleb was at the platform. He had thought about not going, about sending word that she should come to the forge, because he knew what was going to happen when the town saw him standing there waiting for a woman to get off a train. He went anyway. He put on his good coat, the dark wool one he wore to necessary civic occasions, and he walked to the station with Biscuit limping behind him. Half the town seemed to have found reasons to be near the platform that afternoon. They weren't subtle about it. They stood in loose clusters on the opposite side of the street and on the station steps, and their attention was the pointed, barely concealed kind that people use when they want to watch something humiliating happen and need to be able to claim afterward that they just happened to be passing by. Caleb stood at the edge of the platform and waited. The train was 4 minutes late. Those were the longest 4 minutes he'd experienced since the hospital. Then the doors opened and people stepped down, and there she was. She was, as she'd said, a large woman, tall and broad-shouldered, with dark hair pinned under a brown hat and a coat that had been mended at one cuff. She stepped down from the train with a careful deliberateness, like someone accustomed to navigating spaces that weren't built for her, and she looked at the platform with the controlled composure of someone who had been stared at enough times to know how to carry herself through it. She spotted him immediately. He had half expected the thing he'd seen in people's faces his whole life since the accident, the involuntary flinch, the eyes going briefly wide before the person caught themselves and tried to pretend they hadn't reacted. Evelyn Hart's expression didn't do that. She looked at him, took him in fully, and then walked toward him with the same deliberate step she'd come down from the train with. Behind Caleb, he heard someone on the station steps mutter something. Laughter followed it, low and mean. Evelyn heard it too. He could see that she heard it in the slight tightening around her eyes. But she kept walking. He took off his hat. He held out his hand. She took it. Her grip was firm. He noticed that first. Her hand was rough from work, and her grip was the grip of someone who wasn't performing politeness but actually shaking his hand. "Mr. Thorne," she said. "Miss Hart," he said. "You made it." "I said I would." "You did." They stood there for a moment with the crowd watching and the cold coming down off the mountains, and Biscuit sniffed at Evelyn's boot, and she looked down at the dog with something that shifted in her face, softened just slightly, against her will almost. "That's Biscuit," Caleb said. "You mentioned him in your letters." She crouched down, which was not an easy thing in a heavy coat and skirt, and she scratched behind Biscuit's ear with the efficient affection of someone who knew dogs. Biscuit's tail moved twice. That was significant. Biscuit's tail didn't move for most people. "He likes you," Caleb said, and he was aware that he sounded surprised. "Animals usually do." She stood back up. "People less so." "Same for me." She looked at him directly again. She had brown eyes, dark and level. And there was a quality to them that Caleb couldn't name yet. An alertness, a weight of assessment that wasn't unkind but didn't miss anything either. "You look like your letters," she said finally. He wasn't sure what that meant. "How so?" "Straightforward. A little worn. Like you mean what you say." Behind them, another murmured comment from the steps. Another low laugh. Caleb turned his head toward the sound. The group on the steps, 4 men he recognized, including Dale Pritchard, who ran the feed supply, went quiet. They didn't leave, but they went quiet. "Is it always like this?" Evelyn asked. "Yes," he said. He didn't see any point in pretending otherwise. She picked up her smaller bag. "Then I suppose we'd better get used to it together." She paused. "Could you manage the trunk?" "Yes." "Good." She looked at the street ahead of them. "Which way is the forge?" He told her. She started walking. He got the trunk and followed, and Biscuit limped along behind them both, and the crowd on the steps watched them go with the discomfited silence of people who had expected a show and gotten something they didn't quite know what to do with. They were married the following afternoon by Judge Garfield at the courthouse, with no witnesses except the judge's clerk, who was also the woman who cleaned the courthouse and had known Caleb for 8 years and gave him a nod that he understood to be, in its way, a form of blessing. Evelyn signed her name in a clear, deliberate hand. Caleb signed in the cramped script of a man who had large hands and had never been comfortable with a pen. The judge read the necessary words, and they said the necessary words back. And then they were married. Walking back to the forge afterward, Evelyn said, "I want to be clear about something." "All right," Caleb said. "I'm not under any illusions about this situation. We're strangers who made a practical arrangement. I'm not expecting—" She paused. choosing words. I'm not expecting you to feel things you don't feel. I just want us to be honest with each other. That's the one thing I can't function without. Caleb thought about this for several steps. I wrote you 7 letters, he said. Every one of them was honest. I know that, she said. I just want to say it out loud, so we're clear. We're clear. They walked another half block in silence. I saw what you did on the platform, Evelyn said then, her voice quieter. When you turned and looked at those men. What about it? They went quiet. They usually do when someone looks at them directly. People like that operate on the assumption that no one's going to. Evelyn was quiet for a moment. I never thought to try that, she said. It doesn't always work, Caleb said, but it works often enough. She nodded, considering that, and they walked the rest of the way to the forge without speaking, and the silence between them was not empty. It was the silence of 2 people taking each other's measure honestly, without performance, which was more than either of them had managed with anyone else in a very long time. The cabin behind the forge was small, 2 rooms with a wood stove in the main room and a curtain dividing the sleeping area from the kitchen and sitting space. Caleb had cleaned it before she arrived. He had swept the floor twice and washed the one window and replaced the candles and felt, doing all of this, like a man who was performing gestures whose meaning he wasn't entirely sure of. Evelyn stood in the doorway and looked at the space with the practiced eye of someone who has made do with difficult conditions and is already calculating what can be done with them. It's tight, she said. It is, he agreed, but it's clean. She stepped inside and set her bag down, and the stove is a good size. I had it rebuilt 3 years ago. Draws well. She went to the stove and opened the door and looked at the firebox the way a person does when they actually know what they're looking at. Good iron. I made the fittings myself. She closed the stove door and turned to look at him. There was something about the way she moved in a space. Purposeful, cataloging, already beginning to understand the geometry of it, that he found unexpectedly grounding. I'll need to understand the accounts, she said. You mentioned in your letters that that the records needed attention. I'm a blacksmith, he said. I'm not a bookkeeper. The accounts are probably a mess. Probably, she agreed without making it an accusation. I'd like to look at them tomorrow, if that's all right. Whenever you like. She nodded. She moved to the window and looked out at the forge yard, where the anvil and the coal bins and the tool racks were visible through the glass, and the early dark was coming down over everything. Caleb, she said. She hadn't used his first name before. Yes. I'm glad I came. She said it without turning from the window, and she said it simply, without embellishment, the way she'd written in her letters. I don't know yet what this is going to be, but I'm glad I came. He stood in the doorway of his own cabin and felt something shift in his chest that he didn't have good words for. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was more provisional than that. It was the feeling of a door opening in a room he'd kept shut for so long he'd half convinced himself it was a wall. So am I, he said. Biscuit pushed past his legs into the cabin and went directly to the rug near the stove and turned 3 times and lay down, and Evelyn looked at the dog and then at Caleb, and the corner of her mouth moved in what was not quite a smile but was something in that direction, and Caleb thought, all right, maybe. That was the first night. It was not romantic. It was not easy. They were careful with each other in the way of 2 people who had both been hurt by carelessness and had learned the cost of it. They spoke in practical terms about practical things. The sleeping arrangement, the morning schedule, the water pump that stuck in cold weather. Caleb slept in the workshop loft, as he had offered, and Evelyn took the cabin bedroom, and the distance was not cold so much as it was respectful, the kind of distance that 2 honest people maintain while they figure out something that neither of them has done before. But in the morning, she was up before him, and the stove was lit, and there was coffee on, and she was sitting at the table with his account ledgers spread open in front of her, and a look on her face that he recognized instantly from his own reflection when he was working through a problem in metal. Focused, frowning slightly, turning it over. You've been undercharging for shoe work, she said, without looking up, by about 30% based on comparable rates. He poured coffee and sat across from her. How do you know comparable rates? I looked at what the towns to the east are charging, from the trade notices in these papers. She gestured at a stack of old papers she'd found somewhere. And you've got 3 accounts here that haven't paid since spring. Harmon's been promising to settle up. Harmon's been promising. She looked up. Do you want me to write him a letter? Caleb looked at the ledgers, then at her. What kind of letter? A polite one, explaining that the account is overdue and you'd like it settled by the end of the month. He won't like it. I expect not. She held his gaze. Do you want to keep being owed money, or do you want to be paid? Caleb drank his coffee and thought about it. Write the letter, he said. She turned back to the ledgers. That was the second morning, and the third was similar, and the fourth, and by the end of the first week, Caleb had the strange and slightly off-balance sensation of living in his own house and finding that it had been reorganized from the inside. Not intrusively, not without his knowledge, but steadily, by someone who understood what a functional household required and was quietly, systematically supplying it. Harmon paid his account on the 28th of the month. He came in frowning and set the money on the counter and didn't say anything. Caleb thanked him. Harmon left. Evelyn was in the back room and said nothing, but when Caleb came through, she glanced up from what she was doing and gave him a single nod. Word spread the way it always does in a small town, not through announcement, but through repetition of small observations, each one negligible on its own, accumulating into something significant. People noticed that the Thorne accounts were current. They noticed that the pricing had changed, and Caleb no longer looked uncertain when someone pushed back on it. They noticed that the woman who'd come from the train was not, as several of them had privately expected, cowering or miserable or preparing to leave on the next train east. She was, instead, present, walking to the dry goods store in the morning, managing the household with the efficiency of someone who had been doing it for years, sitting occasionally in the forge doorway when the weather was tolerable, with a piece of mending in her hands, watching the street with those level brown eyes that missed nothing. The town had expected a tragedy. It was getting something more complicated. Not everyone was adjusting gracefully to the complication. Victor Hale noticed the changes at the Thorne Forge the way a particular kind of man notices inconvenience, not immediately, but with the slow building attention of someone who has been used to a situation remaining exactly as it suits him and is beginning to register that it's shifting. Victor Hale was not from Colorado. He had come to Raven Creek from the eastern part of the state 7 years ago with capital and connections and the manner of a man who had learned early that the fastest way to get a thing done was to position yourself as the person controlling what other people needed. He owned the largest parcel of land outside of town, 3 businesses on Main Street, and a portion of the water rights on the creek that ran north of the settlement. He was not officially the law, and he was not officially anything, but he had made himself, through patient acquisition, the closest thing to indispensable that the town had. What he did not own was the Thorne property, which sat on a lower section of the creek where the water ran reliable and year-round, and which he had been attempting to acquire, in one form or another, for the last 4 years. He had started with a low offer, which Caleb had declined. He had come back with a higher offer, which Caleb had also declined. He had sent a lawyer with paperwork that suggested there might be a question about the original survey of the Thorne property lines, and Caleb had read the paperwork and told the lawyer to get out and not come back. He had tried once, having Dale Pritchard from the feed store suggest to Caleb over a beer that a man in Caleb's position might find life easier if he sold up and moved somewhere with fewer memories. Caleb had looked at Pritchard for a long moment and then said, "Did Victor Hale send you?" And Pritchard had not been able to hold his gaze, and the conversation ended. That had been 2 years ago. Since then, Victor had been patient in the way of a man who believes patience will eventually produce the result he wants, who believes specifically that Caleb Thorne would eventually become tired enough, or isolated enough, or financially stressed enough to take the offer. Evelyn's arrival had disrupted this calculation in ways Victor was still working out. Caleb didn't know exactly when Victor started paying closer attention to the forge. He knew it happened because the town was small and he was observant, and he began to notice Victor's men, the 2 who seemed to go everywhere with him, Marsh and a younger one called Relly, drifting past the forge at intervals, not doing anything, just drifting. He mentioned it to Evelyn on a Thursday evening, 3 weeks after her arrival. She was at the table with the ledgers again. She had, At this point, reorganized the accounts into a system that Caleb was still learning to read, but that she had explained to him twice with patient, unfussy clarity. "Victor Hale," she said, without looking up, "the man who owns the land east of the creek. You know about him?" "I've asked questions." She turned a page. "He owns 3 of the businesses in town. He has a legal arrangement with the water company in Salida that nobody on Main Street seems to fully understand, and he's been trying to buy this property for years." She looked up. "You didn't mention him in your letters." "I didn't think it seemed like my problem." "It's our property," she said. Not confrontationally, just as a statement of fact. Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Yes," he said. "It is." "Then it's our problem." She looked back at the ledgers. "What does he want with the water access?" Caleb told her. The plan he'd put together from rumors and what he knew of Victor's land holdings. The way control of the lower creek section would give Victor leverage over the farmers and ranchers who depended on it. The way the Thorne property was the piece he needed to close that arrangement. Evelyn listened without interrupting. When he was done, she said, "He's been waiting for you to get desperate enough to sell." "That's what I figure." "And you haven't?" "No." She turned the page again, but he could see she wasn't reading it. She was thinking. "He's going to change his approach," she said. "Why do you say that?" "Because his current approach stopped working when I arrived." She said it plainly, without vanity. "You're not isolated anymore. You have someone managing the books. The accounts are current, the pricing is right, the business is healthier than it was. He was waiting for you to fail financially or to get too tired. That's not happening now." She finally looked up. "So he'll do something else." Caleb looked at her across the table. In the 3 weeks she'd been here, he'd learned several things about her. That she slept lightly, that she was capable of intense, focused silence when she was thinking, that she was not easily frightened, and that she had a habit of looking at problems from angles that didn't occur to him. "What do you think he'll do?" he asked. She thought about it for a moment. "Something that can't be negotiated with," she said. "That's the pattern with men like him. When the slow pressure stops working, they stop being subtle." She paused. "We should make sure we know where the deed is." "I know where it is." "And the survey documents? The ones from when the property was originally recorded?" He looked at her. "Why?" "Because if he's going to come at us, he's going to come at our right to be here." She held his gaze. "Where are they?" He got up and went to the wooden box on the high shelf and found the papers and put them on the table. She read through them carefully, cross-referencing against the ledger entries and a hand-drawn map that had come with the original purchase. It took her 40 minutes. Caleb made more coffee and waited. "These are sound," she said finally. "The survey's properly recorded and the deed's clean. He can't do anything through the courts without fabricating something." She stacked the papers neatly and put them back in the box. "We should get copies made and keep them somewhere else." "Where?" she thought. "The judge. Judge Garfield. He's not in Hale's pocket. I've listened to how people talk about him. He'd hold copies without mentioning it to anyone." Caleb looked at her for a long moment. "You've been paying attention," he said. "I'm always paying attention," she said. Not proudly, just accurately. The copies were made the next day and given to Judge Garfield, who accepted them with the quiet competence of a man who understood, without needing it explained, why they were being left with him. He shook Caleb's hand and then Evelyn's and said, "Sensible precaution." And that was that. 2 days later, Dale Pritchard came into the forge while Caleb was working. He stood at the doorway doing the thing people did when they wanted to seem casual, hanging back, looking at the tools on the wall, like he was interested in the tools. "Pritchard," Caleb said without stopping his work. "Thorne." Pritchard stepped inside. He was a decent enough man in ordinary circumstances, the kind of man who went along with things he probably knew were wrong because it was easier, which Caleb had more contempt for than he did for openly bad people. "Victor asked me to come by." "Then say what he once said." Pritchard cleared his throat. "He wants to know if you've given any more thought to the offer. He said he'd go to 800 now. That's a good price, Caleb. That's real money." The hammer rang against the iron. "No," Caleb said. He's serious about it. The water situation up north is getting complicated, and this property is... Look, He says this is going to be the last time he... Pritchard. Caleb stopped working. He set the hammer down and turned. If you come in here with another offer from Victor Hale, I'm going to stop being polite about how I answer. You understand? Pritchard understood. He left. That evening, Caleb told Evelyn. She didn't say I told you so. She said, "How long until the snowstorm?" He blinked. What? Mrs. Alderman at the dry goods said there's weather coming. Serious weather. A week out, maybe less. That's right. Why? Because whatever Hale does next, she said, he won't do it where people can see him clearly. He'll wait for cover. She looked at him steadily. We should be ready before the snow. Caleb looked at his wife, this woman he'd known for less than a month, who'd arrived with a trunk and a firm handshake and proceeded to understand his life better than anyone who'd known him for years, and felt something he hadn't felt in a very long time. Not safe. That wasn't the right word. Something more useful than safe. Prepared. What do we do? He asked. Keep the accounts where they can be found, she said. Keep the papers with the judge, keep working, keep the business running, and let him see that we're not afraid of him. She met his eyes. And we don't let him separate us. That's the thing men like that do. They try to get you alone. He nodded. Outside, the first breath of real winter came off the mountains and pressed against the cabin walls, and in the forge yard the coals banked down to an orange glow, and Biscuit wheezed on his blanket, and Caleb Thorne sat across from Evelyn Hartthorne at a table covered in account ledgers and deed papers, and understood, with a clarity that surprised him, that the thing that had been missing from his life was not merely company. It was someone who, when the storm came, would face it with him. The storm was coming. They both knew it. They were not, for the first time in a very long time, facing it alone. The snow came 6 days later, not 7. Caleb had been watching the sky since morning, reading the particular gray of it. Not the thin gray of ordinary overcast, but the dense, loaded gray that meant serious weather, the kind that committed. By mid-afternoon, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the wind had shifted from the northwest to something more direct, more personal, and the first flakes were coming sideways off the mountain. Evelyn was in the forge with him. She'd taken to spending part of her mornings there when the work allowed. Not hovering, not in the way, but present. Sitting on the stool near the tool wall with whatever accounts needed attention, asking occasional questions about the work when she had them. She had questions that surprised him. Not the obvious ones, how hot, how long, how hard, but the ones underneath. Why this iron and not that? Why this angle of strike? What made one weld hold and another fail? She learned things quickly, and she didn't ask the same question twice. It's starting, she said, looking at the small window in the forge's west wall. It is. She was quiet for a moment, watching the snow angle past the glass. Is there anything we need to do before it gets bad? Coal's stocked. I brought extra in yesterday. He set the tongs down. Water barrel's full, the horse is in. And the papers are with the judge. And the papers are with the judge. She nodded, satisfied in the methodical way she had when a checklist came out right. She went back to the ledger. What neither of them said was that the preparations they were most concerned about weren't practical ones. The coal and the water barrel were manageable. Victor Hale was something else, and they both knew it, and neither of them found any particular use in saying it out loud again right then. The storm settled in overnight and was serious by morning. By the time Caleb got the forge opened at 6, the snow was already to his knee in the drift against the east wall, and the path to the cabin was gone. He shoveled it back. The wind had teeth. He put his head down and worked and then went in for coffee, and Evelyn was at the stove and handed him a cup without preamble, and he drank it standing at the window watching the street, which was emptying the way streets do when the weather makes its intentions clear. 3 days into the storm, the first thing happened. Tom Alderman from the dry goods store came in just before noon. He was a quiet man, 50s, with the manner of someone who had spent a lifetime not getting involved in other people's disputes and was visibly uncomfortable with what he was doing. He stood at the forge door and turned his hat in his hands while he said it. Caleb, I need to tell you something. Victor came to see me yesterday. He glanced at Evelyn, who was at the table. He seemed uncertain about her presence. Say it, Caleb said. Alderman looked at his hat. He's saying he's going to challenge your water rights. He says he has a survey that puts the property line different from what you've got recorded. He held up a hand. I don't know if it's true. I don't know if it's not. Clara thought you should know. She made me come. Clara thought right, Evelyn said from the table. What survey? Alderman looked at her, startled. Ma'am? What survey is he claiming to have? Who conducted it and when? Alderman blinked. He didn't say specifically. He just said he had documentation that the original survey was wrong. He's lying, Evelyn said without inflection. The original survey is registered with the county, and the property deed is clean. We've already confirmed it, but thank you for coming, Mr. Alderman. Please tell your wife thank you. Alderman left looking slightly dazed, which was an expression Caleb was getting used to seeing on people after they'd spoken with Evelyn. He's manufacturing a paper dispute, she said when the door closed. Can he do that? He can try. It would take time and he'd need a compliant surveyor. She was thinking, her pen tapping lightly against the page. The problem isn't whether he can win in court. It's whether he can make enough noise and enough uncertainty that people start treating this property like it's contested. That affects the business. People won't bring their work to a forge in a legal dispute, Caleb said. Some won't. Others will wait and see. She looked up. We need to be visible. We need people to see us working, functioning, not afraid. The worst thing we can do right now is close up and wait it out inside. That was harder than it sounded, with the snow still coming and the temperature dropping and the kind of cold that made the forge's iron creak and pop when he fired it up. But Caleb kept the doors open the next morning and the morning after that, and Evelyn walked to Alderman's dry goods and to the post office and to the seamstress on the corner, and she did it with the same deliberate, unhurried step she'd come off the train with, and people saw her. Some of them nodded. That was not nothing. On the fourth day of the storm, two things happened. The first was that Marsh, one of Victor's men, came to the forge alone. He was a big man, wide across the shoulders, with a face that had taken damage over the years and wore it carelessly. He came in and stood at the counter and looked at the work on the bench. Nice piece, he said, about the wheel hub Caleb was finishing. He didn't mean it. He said it the way men say things when they're looking for a way into a conversation they've already planned. What do you want, Marsh? Caleb said. Not a question. Marsh smiled with part of his face. Victor wanted me to give you one more chance to think about the offer. He's prepared to go to 1,000. That's more than the property is worth, and you know it. I know it, Caleb agreed, which means what he wants is worth more than 1,000 to him. Marsh's partial smile stayed where it was. Smart man. He glanced around the forge, at the tools, the bellows, the coals. His gaze stopped for a moment on the doorway to the back where Evelyn had been, and where she no longer was. She'd moved, quietly, somewhere Caleb couldn't immediately see. Offer's going to close, Marsh said. Victor's a patient man, but patience isn't the same thing as permanent. Once the storm breaks, things are going to move quickly. Just want you to know that. Now I know it, Caleb said. You can go. Marsh went. The door closed. Caleb turned and found Evelyn standing at the inner doorway, holding a piece of wood she'd apparently picked up from the stack near the stove. She looked at the closed door, then at Caleb. He wasn't looking at the property, she said quietly. He was looking at the building. Caleb had noticed the same thing. Yes. He was checking the layout. She set the wood down. Where things are. Where people are. They looked at each other. Not tonight, Caleb said. Storm's too bad. They can't move in this and have anyone not see them. Tomorrow then, she said, or the night after. Maybe. She thought for a moment. Is there anyone in town who'd watch? Who we could trust to notice if men came onto this property after dark? Caleb thought about it. He ran through the people in Raven Creek the way he knew them. Not as friends mostly, because he hadn't had many of those, but as known quantities. Alderman was a decent man, but not a brave one. The judge was trustworthy but old and not someone who should be out in this weather. The smithing apprentice Caleb sometimes hired, a 19-year-old named Pete Walsh, was reliable and had the useful quality of being unimportant enough that Victor Hale wouldn't notice him. Pete Walsh, he said. The boy who helps with the horses? He's sharp. and he doesn't talk unnecessarily. Can you talk to him without it getting back to Victor? If I do it right. Pete Walsh came by the next morning, and Caleb spoke to him in the forge with the doors closed, quietly and directly, the way he spoke to Pete about work, not explaining more than necessary, trusting the boy to understand what was being asked. Pete listened with the particular seriousness of a young man being treated like his judgment mattered, which was something most people in Raven Creek had not bothered to do with him. I can sleep in the stable, Pete said. I do sometimes anyway in bad weather. Nobody thinks anything about it. You see anyone come onto this property after dark, you come straight to the cabin. Don't engage, just come straight to me. Yes, sir. And don't tell anyone you're doing this. No, sir. Pete paused. Mr. Hale's men. Maybe. Pete looked at the floor, then back up. He was 19 and not easily frightened, which was partly age and partly the fact that he'd grown up poor enough to know that what most men used as threats were not actually the worst things that could happen. I'll be in the stable, he said. The second thing that happened on the fourth day of the storm was more subtle, and Caleb might not have caught it at all if Evelyn hadn't been there. He went to Giddings Hardware at the end of the day for a specific grade of coal, and Giddings was polite enough on the surface but slow to fill the order, slower than usual, and with a quality of distraction that Caleb recognized as discomfort. The kind of distraction that happens when a man has been told something about another man and is working out how to act toward him. Caleb noticed but didn't say anything. Evelyn, who had come with him, noticed Caleb noticing. On the walk back, she said, "Giddings?" "Yes." "Victor's spoken to him." "Looks like." "How many others do you think he's gone to?" Caleb thought about the storefronts on the main street, the businesses that depended on Hale in some way, the ones that shared his water arrangement, the ones that had loans with men connected to Victor. He thought about the way a man with money and patience could make another man inconvenient to know without ever raising his voice. "Enough to matter," he said. She was quiet for a block. Then, "We need to get ahead of it." "How?" "People need to understand what he's actually after. Not the property in the abstract, what he's going to do with the water once he has it. If the farmers east of town understand that controlling this property gives him the leverage to squeeze them on creek access, they'll care," Caleb said, "more than they care about me." "It's not about them caring about you," she said, and there was no sting in it, just efficiency. "It's about them caring about their own situation. You don't need them to like you. You need them to understand that what happens to your property affects them." He stopped walking. She stopped too. "I've been here 11 years, he said. "I've never asked anyone for anything." "I know," she said. "That's not how I operate." "I know that too." She met his eyes. There was no impatience in her face, but no softness either. Just that level, honest attention she brought to everything. "But this isn't about asking for favors. It's about giving people information they need. There's a difference." He stood in the cold thinking about it. The snow had thinned to a fine, constant powder, and the mountain to the north was visible again in outline, pale and enormous and indifferent. "The Garrity brothers," he said finally. "They've got the largest acreage on the East Fork. They're not in Victor's pocket. They're too big for him to have gotten to yet." "Can you talk to them?" "I can try. Nate Garrity brings his horses to me." He started walking again. "I'll go tomorrow." Nate Garrity's property was 2 miles east of town, and the road was rough going in the aftermath of the storm. Drifted in sections, icy in the hollows, the kind of road that made a horse work. Caleb went on horseback because the wagon wouldn't have managed it, and he got to the Garrity place mid-morning and found Nate in the barn with his oldest boy, repairing a fence rail that the storm had brought down. Nate Garrity was a big, deliberate man, not the sort who welcomed surprises or unsolicited visits, and he looked up from the work with the measured expression of a man deciding how to receive an unexpected guest. "Thorne," he said. "Garrity." Caleb got down from the horse. "I need to talk to you about something. It involves your water." That got Nate's full attention. Water rights were the thing you didn't waste words about, not in Colorado, not in winter, not when your livelihood ran on them. They stood in the barn and Caleb told him, flat and direct, the way he did things, about Victor's moves on the Thorne property, about what control of the Lower Creek section would give him, About the way the water arrangement could be leveraged against the farmers on the East Fork if Victor got the access he wanted. Nate listened. He was the kind of man who listened without his face telling you what he thought, and he let Caleb finish completely before he said anything. "You sure about this?" he said. "My wife went through the water company arrangements that are public record. The numbers add up a certain way." "Your wife?" "Evelyn, she's thorough." Nate's son, who was maybe 15, was pretending not to listen from the other side of the barn. Nate looked at Caleb for a long moment. "Victor Hales put money in people's pockets around here," he said. It wasn't a defense of Victor. It was just a fact. "He has," Caleb agreed, "and now he wants yours." "He wants the water access that comes with my property. My forge happens to be on it." Nate picked up the fence rail and turned it in his hands, not doing anything with it, just handling it while he thought. "What do you want from me, Thorne?" "Nothing right now," Caleb said. "I want you to know what's happening. What you do with that is your business." Nate looked at him. "That's an unusual way to ask for help." "I'm not asking for help. I'm giving you information." Caleb felt an echo of Evelyn's phrasing and felt a brief private acknowledgement of it. "What you do with it is your own." He rode back to Raven Creek and told Evelyn how it went, and she listened the way she always did, completely, without interruption, and then said, "He'll talk to the others. Men like Garrity, when they're convinced something affects them, they talk. He might just keep it to himself." "He might," she allowed. "But I don't think so." She paused. "He has too much to lose. Men with a lot to lose talk." She was right. Caleb didn't find out how quickly she was right until 2 days later, when Warren Elja, who farmed the second largest acreage on the East Fork, came to the forge specifically to ask Caleb about the water arrangement. He was followed the next morning by a man named Cutter who ran a small sheep operation and who had heard it from someone who'd heard it from Elja. The word was moving. Victor felt it move. Caleb was certain of that because the temperature in the interactions between Victor's men and anyone in Raven Creek changed in the subtle way that happens when a man with power understands that something he counted on, the silence of people who'd decided not to get involved, is becoming less reliable. Marsh stopped coming by the forge. Relly, the younger one, was seen twice on the street looking at the Thorne property from a distance and then looking away when he noticed Caleb watching. "He's recalculating," Evelyn said. "What do you think he'll come to?" She looked at the window. The storm had broken 2 days ago and the cold had settled in, the dry iron cold that followed a front and made the air brittle and everything in it very clear. "I think he's going to decide that the slow approach has failed," she said. "And I think he's going to come to the same conclusion Marsh was working toward when he came here and looked at the layout of the building." "Say it plainly," Caleb said. "He's going to send men to burn it," she said, "or close to it. Enough damage to make rebuilding feel impossible. Not when anyone's watching, not while it can be traced." She met his eyes. "He needs you to leave, Caleb, one way or another. And you won't leave on your own." The word burn sat in the room between them. Caleb had been burned once. His face had been burned. He knew what fire did, and he had an animal response to the word that he managed, barely, to keep out of his expression. "Pete's been in the stable," he said, "every night since we asked him." She nodded. "But Pete's one person, and if they come in numbers, we tell the judge," Caleb said. "We do." She was already thinking ahead. "And I want to write down everything. What Alderman told us, what Marsh said, the survey claim, all of it, dated and documented, and a copy left with the judge and another in the strongbox." She looked at him directly. "If something happens, I want there to be a record that means something." Caleb looked at his wife and registered, not for the first time, the specific kind of strength she had, not the loud kind, not the confrontational kind, but the prepared kind. The kind that understood that survival was often less about the moment of crisis than about the 10 things you'd done before it arrived. "When did you get like this?" he said, and it came out with something in it that wasn't entirely not warmth. She considered. "I've always been like this," she said. "Nobody asked me to use it before." He thought about that. Then he went and got paper and they sat at the table for 2 hours while she wrote and he provided the dates and the names and the words he remembered. and the candle burned down and Biscuit wheezed on the rug, and the iron cold settled over Raven Creek. And the record they were building, careful fact by careful fact, was the quiet kind of weapon that neither Marsh nor Relly nor Victor Hale would think to worry about. Outside, Pete Walsh was in the stable, wrapped in his bedroll, listening to the horses breathe. And the night held still and cold and waiting. 4 days after the storm broke, Caleb went to Judge Garfield with Evelyn's documentation, 4 pages in her careful handwriting, each entry dated, each conversation recorded with the flat precision of someone who'd learned that the details were what mattered in a dispute. The judge read it at his desk with his glasses on, turning each page slowly, and when he was done, he took them off and folded his hands on top of the papers. "This is a careful record," he said. "My wife put it together," Caleb said. "I had that impression from the handwriting." The judge looked at Caleb over the rims of his glasses. "You understand I can't act on this unless something happens. It's documentation, not evidence of a crime." "I understand. I want it on record that we came to you, so that if something does happen, the sequence is established." The judge looked at him for a long moment. "You're expecting something to happen." "I think so, yes." The judge tapped the papers once with his finger. "I'll keep these with the deed copies." He paused. "Stay visible, Caleb. Keep working. Don't do anything that can be twisted into looking like provocation." "My wife said the same thing." "Your wife," the judge said, "seems like a woman of considerable good sense." He put the papers in the locked drawer of his desk. "Tell her that from me." Caleb walked back from the courthouse and found Evelyn at the forge, talking to Pete Walsh. This in itself was not unusual. She'd been spending more time at the forge as the weeks went on, and she and Pete had developed the easy, practical rapport of two people who shared a working space and respected each other's competence. What was unusual was what Pete was holding, a short, hand-drawn map of the forge property, showing the entry points, the angle of the light from the street lantern, the shadows. Caleb stopped. "What's this?" Pete looked up. "Mrs. Thorne asked me to draw what I could see from the stable at night, entry angles and such." Caleb looked at Evelyn. "If they come," she said, "I want to understand where they'll come from." She said it like it was the most ordinary thing. Pete's been watching every night. He knows what the property looks like in the dark. Caleb looked at the map. At the careful marks Pete had made, at the lantern shadow indicated by a few short lines, at the X that marked where the stable door stood relative to the forge entrance. "If they come from the east," Pete said, "there's a shadow between the woodshed and the coal bins where they can move without being in the light. That's the way I'd do it, if I was doing it." Caleb looked at the boy. 19 years old, standing in a forge drawing tactical maps because a woman had asked him a precise question and he'd taken it seriously. "You'd have made a good soldier," Caleb said. "Didn't want to be a soldier," Pete said. "I like horses." "Keep watching," Caleb said. He didn't look at Evelyn directly after Pete left. He went back to the iron he'd been working on before he went to the judge. He picked up the hammer and felt the weight of it, the familiar balance. "You're not angry?" Evelyn said from behind him. It wasn't a question, she was checking. "No," he said. "I didn't tell you beforehand because I wasn't sure it would come to anything." "I know." He struck the iron. It's a good map." She was quiet for a moment, and he could hear in the quality of the silence that she was relieved. Not dramatically, not visibly, but the relief was there. "One more thing," she said. He kept working. "What?" "If they do come, when they do come, I'm not going to stay in the cabin." He stopped. He set the hammer down slowly. He turned. Evelyn was standing with her arms folded, not aggressively, but the way she stood when she'd made a decision and wanted the person she was talking to understand that it had already been made. "This is my home too," she said. "I'm not going to sit in the cabin and wait to find out if I still have one." Caleb looked at her. At the set of her jaw, at the level, unapologetic directness in her eyes. He thought about arguing. He understood, in the same moment, that arguing would be wrong, not because she was his wife, but because she was right, and because she was capable, and because treating her otherwise would be a lie they both knew was a lie. "Stay close to me," he said. "I intend to," she said. They stood like that for a moment, the forge heat between them and the cold outside pressing at the walls, and the thing between them, the thing that had been building for weeks out of letters and practical arrangements and honest silences, and the particular intimacy of two people preparing together for something difficult, pressed up close to the surface of the ordinary without either of them reaching for it. Then Caleb turned back to the iron, and Evelyn went back to the accounts, and Biscuit slept, and the cold held, and the next night came on dark and clear and very quiet, and Pete Walsh lay in the stable watching the shadows between the woodshed and the coal bins, and in the cabin Caleb sat awake long after Evelyn's lamp went out, listening to the silence and knowing, in the way you know things before they happen, that the quiet was the last of its kind. Pete came to the cabin door at 2:30 in the morning. He didn't knock loudly. 3 quick raps, the way Caleb had told him, the way they'd agreed, but Caleb was already awake, sitting in the chair near the wood stove with his boots on and his coat across his lap, and he was at the door before the 3rd knock landed. Pete's face in the dark was pale and tight. He was breathing hard from running. 4 of them, Pete said, coming from the east, through the shadow line, like I said. They've got something. I couldn't see what. Cans, maybe. The way they were carrying them. Caleb felt the word cans land in his chest like cold iron. How far out? 2 minutes? Maybe less. I came straight. Pete was trying to steady his breathing. One of them's Marsh. I recognized his size. The others, I don't know. Caleb turned. Evelyn was already behind him, dressed, her coat on, her hair pinned back in the fast, practical way she did it when there wasn't time. She had heard every word through the thin cabin wall. Go to the judge, Caleb told Pete. Right now. Don't stop anywhere. Pound on his door until he opens it and tell him they're here. Tell him we need the sheriff. Pete went. His footsteps disappeared into the dark. Caleb pulled his coat on. Evelyn had already moved past him into the forge, and when he followed her in, she was at the far wall where the long tools hung. The tongs, the handled hammers, the heavy implements of the trade that had no other purpose than the work, but which were, in the hands of a person who understood their weight, not nothing. She took down the large cross-peen hammer, the one Caleb used for heavy stock. It was 4.5 pounds of iron on an ash handle, and she held it the way someone holds a thing they've already decided about. Evelyn, don't, she said. Not angrily, just settled. He looked at her. The forge coals were banked low, and the light they threw was orange and inconsistent. And in it, Evelyn's face was composed in a way that was not calm exactly. It was the expression of someone running controlled, directed fear rather than letting it run them. He didn't argue. He picked up his own hammer from the bench. They heard the coal bin door first, a scrape of wood and metal, the sound Pete had mapped for them, the entry point through the shadow between the shed and the bins. Caleb positioned himself to the left of the forge entrance, where the light from the street lantern didn't reach, and the interior shadow was deepest. He put his hand out, and Evelyn moved without being told to the right side, behind the anvil post, where she had cover and a clear line of sight to the entry. 2 minutes was almost exactly how long it took. The first man through the door was not Marsh. He was younger, with the quick, low posture of someone who's done this kind of thing before, and knows to clear the threshold fast. He had a can in his left hand and something in his right, and he was already moving before his eyes had adjusted to the difference in light, and he nearly walked into Caleb's extended arm before he saw him. He pulled up short. The can sloshed. The smell hit. Coal oil, sharp and unmistakable. Set it down, Caleb said. The man didn't set it down. He swung the thing in his right hand, which turned out to be a short length of pipe, and Caleb took it on the left forearm instead of the skull, which was where it had been aimed, and the pain came in fast and bright, and he stepped into it rather than back from it and hit the man in the chest with his right hand. Not with the hammer, not yet, just with his fist, hard enough to drive the air out of him. The can hit the floor. Coal oil spread. From the right side of the forge, Evelyn's voice, "Stop, right now." The second man who'd come through had pulled up at the sound of it, at the voice from the dark, which was not where he'd expected a voice to be. And when he turned, he saw Evelyn standing behind the anvil post with the cross-peen raised to shoulder height and the kind of expression on her face that communicated very clearly that she was not performing a warning. He stopped. Marsh came in third. Caleb heard him before he saw him. The particular heavy footstep, the width of the man filling the doorway. Marsh took in the scene with the speed of someone experienced enough to read a situation fast, and what he read was this. His first man down on one knee, coughing, coal oil spreading across the floor, Caleb Thorne standing over him with blood from the forearm hit already darkening his sleeve, and Evelyn Hart Thorne behind the anvil with 4.5 pounds of iron at her shoulder and absolute conviction on her face. Marsh stopped in the doorway. "Hale sent you," Caleb said. He said it as a statement because it was one. Marsh said nothing. "The judge is being woken up right now," Caleb said, "and the sheriff. You want to be here when they arrive. That's your choice." Something moved through Marsh's expression that wasn't fear exactly, but was adjacent to it. The particular recalculation of a man who has run into something he wasn't prepared for. He looked at the coal oil on the floor. He looked at Caleb's arm. He looked at Evelyn, who had not moved and had not lowered the hammer. Then he looked at his first man, still on one knee. "Get up," Marsh said. The man got up. He was holding his ribs. "The can stays," Caleb said. Marsh looked at the can on the floor for a moment. He left it. They went back through the door they'd come in. The fourth man, the one Pete had counted, who had apparently stayed at the east entry and never come in, went with them. Their footsteps crunched through the snow and then were gone, and the silence came back in fast and total, the way it does after something violent, like the air is reconsidering itself. Caleb stood in the middle of the forge and breathed. His forearm was bad. He could feel it swelling already inside the sleeve, and when he tried to close his hand, the pain went all the way to his shoulder. Evelyn was beside him before he'd registered she'd moved. She took his left arm by the wrist and turned it gently and pushed the sleeve back. The forearm was darkening from the wrist to below the elbow, the bruise already spreading under the skin. "It's not broken," he said. She pressed along the bone carefully with 2 fingers. He kept his face still. "Maybe not," she said. "But it's close. I'll deal with it. I know you will." She released his arm. Her hands were steady. She looked at the coal oil on the floor, at the abandoned can, at the door through which Marsh had left. "We need to make sure the floor doesn't catch from the coals before we can clean this up." She was right. The banked forge was 10 feet from the edge of the spill. She was already moving toward the water barrel at the wall. "Evelyn," he said. She stopped. "You didn't move," he said. "When the second man came in, you didn't—" He didn't have a precise word for it. Flinch, break, give. "You held." She looked at him over her shoulder. "I said I wouldn't stay in the cabin." "I know, I just—" He stopped. "Thank you." She turned back to the water barrel without acknowledging it, which was how she received things she didn't know what to do with, by setting them aside temporarily and coming back to them when there was time. He understood that about her by now. They were cleaning the floor when Pete came back with Judge Garfield, and Judge Garfield came with the sheriff, a man named Cord Beale, who was 50-ish and had the weathered, complicated face of someone who had spent years navigating a town where the powerful man and the right thing were not always in the same direction. Beale looked at the floor. He looked at the coal oil can. He looked at Caleb's forearm, which was visibly swollen now under the pushed-back sleeve. "How many?" he said. "4," Caleb said. Marsh was one of them. Beale's expression shifted in a small, controlled way. Marsh was identifiable. Marsh was Victor Hale's man, which meant this was no longer an ambiguous situation. "You have witnesses?" "Pete Walsh. He was in the stable. He saw them come in from the east." Pete Walsh, standing behind the judge, with the look of someone who had run 2 miles in the dark and was still feeling it, nodded confirmation. "And the can," Evelyn said. She was standing at the edge of the lantern light, composed and direct. "The can they brought in. It has coal oil in it still. That's theirs." Beale looked at the can. "We have documentation," Evelyn continued, "with Judge Garfield. Dated records of the approach, the offers Hale made, the survey claim, the visit Marsh made to this property before the attack, what he said when he said it." She let that settle. "There's a record of all of it. Beale looked at the judge. Judge Garfield said, "I have the papers. Everything she says is in there." Beale was quiet for a moment. There was something working in his face. The complicated thing, the thing that happened when a man who has been navigating carefully suddenly runs out of room to navigate. "I'll go to Hale's property in the morning," he said. "Tonight," Caleb said. Beale looked at him. "They'll clean up whatever they brought," Caleb said. "They'll move things. By morning, the story will have changed." He held Beale's gaze. "You know how this works." Another silence. Beale looked at the oil on the floor, at the can, at the bruised forearm, at the judge, at Pete Walsh, who was 19 years old and had come when asked and was still standing in the forge at 3 in the morning because it was right to. "I know how it works," Beale said quietly. He went that night. What happened at Victor Hale's property in the next 2 hours was assembled afterward from pieces, from what Beale said officially, from what his deputy mentioned to someone who mentioned it to Pete Walsh, from the version that moved through Raven Creek in the days that followed with the speed and certainty of a story that confirms what people already suspected. Marsh was at the property. He had a cut on his hand that corresponded to a tool rack in the forge that had caught him on his way through. The other man, the one Caleb had hit in the chest, was there too, still breathing with some difficulty. There were 2 more cans of coal oil in a shed outbuilding, not yet used, along with the length of the same pipe that had come down on Caleb's arm. Victor Hale was present for all of it. He was dressed, which struck Beale as significant. A man woken from sleep doesn't dress before answering the door. He had been waiting for his men to come back. He did not come back with them. Victor Hale had money and connections and the habit of being the most powerful man in the room, but he had something working against him now that money and connections and habit couldn't fully address, which was Evelyn's 4 pages of dated documentation and a coal oil can with his man's fingerprints on it and a 19-year-old witness who had seen them come onto the Thorne property at 2:30 in the morning carrying it. Beale arrested Marsh and the man with the damaged ribs that night. He brought them to the jail on the east side of town. He told Victor Hale to remain available. He said this in a tone that indicated he was no longer performing the careful navigation he'd been doing for years. Caleb found all of this out the next morning when Beale came to the forge. Evelyn had wrapped Caleb's forearm overnight with a tight cloth bandage and made him keep it elevated, which he did when she was watching and not when she wasn't. The swelling had not improved much. He could still use the hand, but the grip was weaker than it should be, and the ache went deeper than surface bruising. "Marsh is in a cell," Beale said. He stood at the forge door with his hat in his hands. "And his associate. I'm charging them with breaking and entering and intent to destroy property. That's what I can make stick right now." "And Victor?" Caleb said. Beale's jaw worked. "Victor's lawyered up. He was there, but he wasn't here, and proving he directed it." "The documentation," Evelyn said. "Shows a pattern," Beale said. "Yes. His lawyer's going to say it shows a man making legitimate business offers that were declined. The coal oil—" He stopped. He looked frustrated in the way of a man who knows what he knows and is running into the limits of what he can formally establish. "The coal oil is Marsh's problem, officially," Evelyn said. "What would make it Victor's problem officially?" Beale looked at her. "Someone who'd testify that Victor gave the order." The silence that followed this was the particular kind that happens when everyone in the room knows something and is trying to decide what to do with it. Marsh had worked for Victor Hale for 7 years. That was not the working relationship of a man likely to turn easily. But the man with the damaged ribs was different. He wasn't a long-time employee. He was someone Marsh had brought in from outside. Beale had established that already, which meant his loyalty to Victor Hale was transactional and relatively shallow, and he was currently sitting in a jail cell with broken or badly bruised ribs and a charge that could follow him to the next territory and the one after that. "Let me talk to him," Evelyn said. Both men looked at her. "The one with the ribs," she said. "Not Marsh. The other one." "You can't," Beale started. "I'm not asking to conduct an interrogation," she said patiently. "I'm asking to have a conversation with someone who's in a cell and doesn't know what his options are." She looked at Beale steadily. "I've been managing accounts for men who didn't think I was worth talking to for years. I know how to talk to someone who's decided not to listen." Caleb said nothing. He watched Beale. Beale looked at the ceiling. He looked at the floor. He looked like a man making a decision he would not be able to explain procedurally if asked. "I wasn't there," he said finally. "If someone had a conversation with a prisoner while I was tending to paperwork in the front room, I wouldn't know about it." The man's name was Ed Coyle. He was 31, from Wyoming, and he had the lean and temporarily diminished look of someone whose ribs made every breath a reminder of a bad decision. He was sitting on the bunk in the cell when Evelyn came in, and he looked up at her with the expression of a man who'd been expecting the sheriff and had received instead something he didn't have a category for. She pulled the chair from the corner to within 4 feet of the cell bars and sat down. "I'm Evelyn Thorne," she said. "The forge is mine and my husband's. You were in it last night." He said nothing. He looked at his hands. "You don't know Victor Hale," she said. "Not the way Marsh does. Marsh has been with him 7 years. You came in for this job specifically." She waited. "Where did Marsh find you?" He looked up. His eyes were the careful eyes of someone calculating how much he'd already given away. "I'm not asking to use it against you," she said. "I'm asking because I want you to understand something. Marsh has a reason to stay quiet. Victor Hale will take care of Marsh because Marsh has 7 years of things he could say. You have none of that. You have no protection here. Victor Hale doesn't know your name this morning, and if he does know it, he's very glad you're in that cell and not talking." Coyle's jaw tightened. "You're going to carry a charge to Wyoming and beyond," she continued, her voice the same. Not threatening, not wheedling, just flat and factual and impossible to dismiss. "For a man who hired you for one night's work and doesn't remember your face, that's the situation." She folded her hands in her lap. "I'm not the sheriff, and I'm not a lawyer, and I can't promise you anything official. But if you told Sheriff Beale that Victor Hale gave the instruction, specific words, when, where, who was there, that becomes a different situation for everyone involved, including you." Coyle looked at the floor, looked at her, looked at the floor again. "He said it at the table," Coyle said finally. His voice was low and careful, like he was listening to himself speak. "At Hale's main house 2 nights ago, Marsh and me and Relly. Victor Hale sat at the head of the table and he said," he stopped, breathed through the rib pain. "He said he wanted the forge out of commission before the Creek negotiations in March. He said he didn't care how. He said if Thorne was in the forge when it went, that was Thorne's problem for being there." Evelyn was very still. "He said that last part," she said, "specifically." "Yes, ma'am." Coyle looked at her with something that wasn't quite shame and wasn't quite relief. "He said it plain." She stood up. She smoothed her skirt. She said, "Thank you, Mr. Coyle," with the same tone she used for everything, level, without warmth but without cruelty either. And she went to find Sheriff Beale, who was at his desk attending to paperwork. Caleb was waiting outside the jail on the cold street. He saw her face when she came out and read it immediately. "He talked," he said. "He talked." She pulled her coat tighter. "Victor said it in front of 3 witnesses. One of them is willing to say so." Caleb stood very still. The cold morning air cut between them. "He said if I was in the forge when it went," he said. "That was my problem." "Yes." The words settled. Caleb had known, in the abstract way of someone who has been paying attention, that Victor wanted him gone badly enough to do serious things. Hearing the specific shape of it, the casual way a man at a table can discuss another man's death, was something else. "Are you all right?" Evelyn said. "I've been hated before," he said. "Being hated is different from being considered disposable." He looked at her. She was watching him with the careful attention she brought to structural problems. Not pity, not performance, but a genuine concern for whether the thing was holding or showing stress. "I'm all right," he said. She accepted that and didn't press it. What followed over the next 4 days moved in the way of legal and civic machinery when it finally decides to move. Not quickly, but with a momentum that built on itself and became hard to stop. Beale took Coyle's statement formally, with the judge present. Relly, confronted separately and told that Coyle had already spoken, decided that loyalty to Victor Hale was worth less than he'd previously calculated, and confirmed the table conversation with enough detail to establish that he'd been there. Victor Hale's lawyer filed 2 objections and a counter-narrative that attributed everything to Marsh acting without instruction. But Coyle had given Beale the specific language before the Creek negotiations in March, "I don't care how." And Relly had given him the location and the approximate time, and together that was more than Victor's story could absorb. The arrest happened on a Tuesday morning. Beale went to the Hale property with his deputy and came back with Victor Hale in the back of a wagon, and Victor sat in that wagon with the rigid, dangerous composure of a man who believed this was temporary and was already planning his response. He did not look defeated. He looked delayed. But he was in the wagon, and that was visible. Raven Creek saw it. That was the thing Evelyn had understood from the beginning, that visibility was power in a small town, that people moved toward what they could see clearly and away from ambiguity. They had seen Caleb and Evelyn on the platform. They had seen the forge stay open through the storm. They had seen Evelyn walk to the dry goods in the morning, and the accounts come current and the farmers from the East Fork come to ask questions. And now they saw Victor Hale in the back of a wagon on a Tuesday morning. The story was becoming legible to them. Tom Alderman came to the forge that afternoon, which was the first time he'd come voluntarily since the early days when he'd delivered his uneasy warning. He stood at the door and said, "Clara wanted me to bring you this." And he held out a covered dish that turned out to contain a meat pie. "She made two. We've been—" She felt— He stopped. He looked uncomfortable in the specific way of a man who knows he stood aside when he should have stood up. "She wanted you both to have something warm." Caleb took the dish. "Thank you, Tom." Alderman nodded and turned to go and then stopped. "Caleb," he didn't turn back. "I should have come sooner. About what I heard. I should have— Clara had to make me." "I know," Caleb said, "but you came." Alderman left. Evelyn had watched the exchange from the doorway between the forge and the cabin. When Alderman was gone, she came and looked at the dish in Caleb's hand. "Clara Alderman's a good cook," she said. "Tom's a follower." "Yes, but he came." "He did." Caleb carried the dish into the cabin and set it on the table. "That's something." "It's the beginning of something," Evelyn said, and there was in her voice not triumph or satisfaction, but the careful recognition of someone who has watched a thing shift from impossible to possible and knows better than to celebrate before the shift holds. The shift was holding. Nate Garrity came into town 2 days after Victor's arrest. He came with his oldest son, and he came to the forge specifically, and he stood at the counter where Dale Pritchard had stood months earlier with Victor's offer, and he said, "The East Fork farmers are meeting on Saturday. We'd like you and your wife to come." Caleb looked at him. "What kind of meeting?" "The kind where people decide what they want the water situation in this valley to look like," Garrity said. He looked briefly at Evelyn. "Your wife's name has come up in the conversation, in connection with the documentation she put together." "My wife's name," Caleb said. "People want to talk to her," Garrity said flatly, "about the water company arrangement, what it means and what it doesn't." He looked at Evelyn directly. "Can you explain it so farmers can understand it?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "Then come on Saturday." Garrity left. Caleb looked at Evelyn. She was doing the thing she did when she'd processed something before he had, moving back to what she'd been working on, returning to the practical surface of things while what had just happened settled underneath. "They want to talk to you," Caleb said. "They want information," she said without looking up. "That's what I have." "Evelyn?" She looked up. 11 years in this town," he said. "Nobody's ever come to me for information about anything except iron." She held his gaze. He could see that she understood what he was saying. Not that it was about him, but that it was about what the two of them together had become that neither of them had been separately. He knew she understood it because he could see it register in her eyes before she looked back at the ledger, and because the line of her shoulders changed in a way he'd learned to read, a subtle settling that meant she'd felt something she hadn't expected to feel. "Saturday, then," she said. "Saturday," he agreed. Biscuit raised his head from the blanket and looked at both of them with the mild, affectionate blankness of a very old dog who approved of the current arrangement and had no complaints. His tail moved once, Outside, the cold was still serious, but the sky to the south was showing a thin strip of something lighter than it had been. The first tentative indication that the winter, which had pressed down so long and so completely, might eventually be willing to consider other options. Caleb stood at the forge that evening working the iron while the light faded, the rhythm of it steady and familiar, the heat of the coals at his front and the cold of the door at his back. And he was aware in some inarticulate way that the thing he'd been afraid of since Evelyn arrived, not that she would leave exactly, but that what they had would turn out to be less than it appeared, would prove to be two practical people in a practical arrangement and nothing more, was not the thing that had happened. What had happened was harder to name and more substantial than he knew how to say, but Biscuit's tail had moved and Evelyn had said Saturday, and the accounts were in order and the papers were with the judge, and Victor Hale's lawyer was running out of room, and in the morning there was going to be coffee on the stove before he was up. He kept working. The hammer fell. The iron held. The Saturday meeting was held at the Garrity barn, which was the largest enclosed space on the East Fork and smelled appropriately of horses and dry hay, and the particular coldwood smell of a building that had stood through many winters. Nate Garrity had set out planks on sawhorses for seating and a table at the front end where Evelyn could spread her papers, and by the time Caleb and Evelyn arrived on foot, the road had cleared enough for walking, if not comfortably for a wagon. There were already 14 men inside and more coming through the door behind them. Caleb had not been in a room with this many people who were looking at him with something other than discomfort in a very long time. He registered that fact and did not know exactly what to do with it, so he did what he always did with things he didn't know what to do with, which was to set it aside and focus on the work. Evelyn went directly to the table. She laid out her papers, the copies she'd made of the water company documents, the ledger notation she'd cross-referenced, the hand-drawn diagram she'd prepared showing the creek access points, and the properties that depended on them. She arranged them with the same methodical efficiency she brought to the account books, and the men who'd arrived first drifted toward the table the way people drift toward something that looks like it has answers. Nate Garrity called the room to order with the informal authority of a man on his own property. He said, "Mrs. Thorne's going to explain what she found. Let her finish before you ask things." Evelyn looked at the room. 14 men had become 22 by her count, plus 3 women who had come with their husbands and stood at the back with the practical presence of people who intend to hear everything whether or not they're formally invited to be there. She started with the water company arrangement. Not the emotional version, not the outrage version, but the numbers. The actual terms that Victor Hale had with the company in Salida, what those terms meant for access fees, what the fee structure would look like if control of the lower creek passed to a single private holder, what the farmers on the East Fork could expect to pay per season versus what they paid now. She used plain language. She stopped when she saw confusion and explained it again differently. She did not perform, she reported, and the room was quiet in the concentrated way of people who are receiving information they need and know it. Warren Elgee asked the first question. "So the lower creek access is the piece that changes everything?" "Yes," Evelyn said. "The upper water rights are already distributed, but the lower section, where our property sits, is the choke point. Whoever controls that controls the distribution capacity for the whole East Fork in a dry year, and we've had 3 dry years in the last 5. And Hale knew this, said a man Caleb didn't know by name, though he recognized him as one of the smaller farmsteads northeast of town. "He's been working toward it for 4 years, Evelyn said. "The property offers to my husband. That was the last piece he needed." Someone at the back said, "So what happens to his holdings now, with him arrested?" Evelyn looked at Caleb. This was the part she'd discussed with Judge Garfield 2 days earlier, and Caleb answered it because it was the legal part, and the judge had explained it to him directly. "The charges against Hale are serious enough that his lawyer's primary concern is the criminal case," Caleb said. "His business arrangements are going to be under scrutiny. The water company contract in Salida, Evelyn believes, and the judge didn't disagree, that when that arrangement gets examined in the context of the case, there are questions about how it was structured." "What kind of questions?" Garrity asked. "The kind that involve who signed what and whether the county water board knew the full terms," Evelyn said. I've written to the county office in Denver. I expect a response in 2 weeks. The room absorbed this. Then Warren Elgie said, You wrote to Denver. Yes. On your own initiative. It seemed like the relevant next step, Evelyn said, with no particular emphasis. There was a silence. Then Nate Garrity made a sound that was approximately a laugh, short and surprised and not unkind, and Warren Elgie shook his head slowly, and the tension in the room shifted into something more workable. The meeting ran 2 hours. By the end of it, the East Fork farmers had agreed collectively to document their own water usage and access arrangements. Evelyn explained what to record and how, and to submit those records to the county board when the time came. They agreed to act together rather than separately, which was the thing that was hardest for men who had spent their working lives acting alone on their own land and trusting no one's judgment about it but their own. It was Nate Garrity who said it plainly, near the end. We should have paid attention sooner. When Hale was working on Thorne, we let it be Thorne's problem. If we'd stood together earlier, we're standing together now, Warren Elgie said. He wasn't letting Garrity carry the guilt, which Caleb noted and respected. Walking back to town afterward, Caleb and Evelyn were quiet for the first half-mile. The road was hard-packed snow, and the afternoon light was already going, that early Colorado darkness that arrived like an announcement. Caleb's forearm ached. He'd worked through it all week, but it hadn't fully resolved, and he knew it wasn't going to for a while yet. You wrote to Denver, he said. I did. When? 8 days ago. She walked steadily, watching the road. I wasn't sure it would come to anything, so I didn't mention it. He thought about this. There was a version of himself, the version from before, the one who had managed everything alone for 11 years. That would have felt something sharp about not being told. He noticed that version and found it was not entirely him anymore. What did you say in the letter? He asked. I asked for clarification on the terms of private water contracts within county jurisdiction. I framed it as a general inquiry from a property owner. She paused. I didn't mention Hale by name. I didn't want to flag it before we knew how the criminal case would go. Smart, he said. Careful, she corrected. There's a difference. They walked. The cold was settling in the way it did at this hour, dropping fast and final. Those women at the back, Caleb said. Garrity's wife, the others. I saw them. They were listening hard. Women always listen hard when someone's explaining how money works, Evelyn said, because nobody explains it to us directly. We have to get it secondhand or figure it out ourselves. There was no bitterness in it, just the flat observation of someone used to working with the actual conditions of a situation. Caleb looked at his wife walking beside him in the failing light, in her mended coat with her papers under her arm, and felt something that had been loosening slowly for weeks pull entirely free. He didn't try to name it. He had learned, over the course of his adult life, that some things resisted naming and were better approached sideways, acknowledged in increments rather than announced. Evelyn, he said. Yes. He didn't say anything more for a moment. She waited. She was good at waiting. She didn't fill silences reflexively, which was one of the things he'd come to depend on without noticing. I want you to know, he said, that I understand what you've done here. For this. For us. And I don't take it lightly. She was quiet for several steps. I know you don't, she said. I'm not sure I've said it before. You haven't, she said, but I knew it. She glanced at him sidelong. You're not a man who takes things lightly. It's one of the things I understood about you from the letters. They reached the edge of town. The lights of the main street were visible ahead, warm and small against the dark. What else did you understand from the letters, he said, and he was aware that it was closer to a personal question than he usually asked, and that he was asking it intentionally. Evelyn considered for a long moment. That you were lonely in a way you'd stopped expecting to fix, she said, and that you were still honest about it, which means you hadn't given up, just put it somewhere and tried to leave it there. She paused. I recognize that. He didn't say anything. The forge light was visible ahead, the lantern he'd left burning at the door. Is that too direct? She asked, and there was in her voice for the first time something that was uncertain, not afraid, but genuinely asking, and he understood that this was Evelyn without the armor of efficiency, and that she extended it rarely and only when she trusted, and that she was extending it now. No, he said. It's not too direct. Good, she said. And that was all she said. But when they walked through the forge yard, she was a half step closer than usual, and it was not an accident. The next morning brought a development that Caleb hadn't anticipated, though Evelyn, characteristically, had considered the possibility. Dale Pritchard came to the forge just after breakfast. He didn't hang at his door this time looking at the tools. He came in and stood at the counter and faced Caleb directly, which cost him something, visibly. I want to tell you something, Pritchard said. All right, Caleb said. Victor Hale told me what to say when I came here, that time with the offer. He said it evenly, watching Caleb's face. I knew what he was doing. I'm not going to pretend otherwise. I knew, and I came anyway because it was easier. And I want you to know I know that's not... He stopped. I'm sorry for it. The forge was warm. Biscuit was on the blanket. Evelyn was in the back room and had, with the self-discipline she applied to moments that were not hers to be part of, not come through. Caleb looked at Pritchard for a long moment. You came and said what he paid you to say, Caleb said. And then you didn't come back. That's something. It's not much. No, Caleb agreed, but it's something. Pritchard exhaled. He put his hat back on. He looked like a man who had come prepared for something worse than what he got, and who wasn't entirely sure the lack of worse thing made him feel better. If there's anything you need, Pritchard said, from the feed store. Anything. He left it open, unspecified, which was the offer of a man who didn't know exactly what he was offering, but wanted to have offered it. I'll let you know, Caleb said. Pritchard left. Evelyn appeared in the doorway 30 seconds later with the timing of a woman who had been listening from exactly where she'd said she wouldn't be. He's not a bad man, she said. No, just not a brave one. They're more common than the other kind. She leaned against the doorframe. He'll be useful. Caleb looked at her. That's a cold way to put it. It's an accurate way, she said, without apology, having Pritchard willing to say publicly that Hale directed him. That matters. When this goes to a formal hearing, it matters. She paused. I don't need him to be a hero. I need him to do the right thing when it counts. Caleb thought about that. You've been thinking like this for a while. Since before I got off the train, she said. He looked at her steadily. Were you afraid when you got here? She met his eyes. There was a long pause, the kind that in Evelyn meant she was deciding whether to give an honest answer or a manageable one. Yes, she said. I was afraid you'd be disappointed. In what? In me. She said it with the particular flatness of someone who has held a thing for a long time and has decided to set it down. I'd told you I was capable. I'd presented myself a certain way in the letters, and then I had to get off the train in front of a crowd of people who'd already decided what I was, and I had to hold that. He was quiet. I wasn't afraid of the crowd, she said. I was afraid you'd see me through their eyes, just for a second, just long enough for me to see it in your face. Caleb thought about the platform, about the sound from the station steps, about what his face had done when he saw her coming toward him. What did you see? He asked. In my face. She looked at him for a long moment. You took your hat off, she said. That's what I saw. He understood. It was not a small thing, in that context, in front of those people. She had understood that too. I wasn't disappointed, he said. I know, she said. I knew by the time we got to the cabin. She looked at him steadily. I just wanted to say it out loud. He nodded once. She pushed off the doorframe and went back to what she'd been doing, and the morning resumed, and neither of them felt the need to say anything further, because there are conversations that finish a thing and conversations that begin one, and this one had done both at once. The hearing was set for the 3rd week of March, which gave Victor Hale's lawyer time to file motions, and gave the county board in Denver time to send a representative in response to Evelyn's letter, which arrived 12 days after she'd sent it. The representative's name was Aldous Crane, and he was a precise, thin-faced man of 50 who wore a city coat and walked carefully on the icy streets, and whose arrival in Raven Creek caused a particular kind of ripple, the ripple of a small town being looked at by someone with official standing from somewhere larger. Evelyn met with Crane the morning after he arrived, at the courthouse, with Judge Garfield present. Caleb was there, but did not speak much. He watched Crane work through Evelyn's documentation, the water arrangement analysis, the cross-referenced numbers, the letter she'd sent, and watched the man's face do the thing that happened when a careful, bureaucratic mind encountered careful work and recognized it as such. "This analysis is thorough," Crane said at one point. "The numbers are public record," Evelyn said. "I just put them in order." Crane looked at a page. "Where did you learn to read water contracts?" "I learned to read accounting documents in a commercial laundry in Cincinnati," she said. "The principles are the same. Numbers either add up or they don't." Crane looked at her over his papers. He had the slightly recalibrating expression of a man who had arrived with assumptions and was in the process of revising them. "The arrangement Hale had with the Solida Company," he said. "This fee schedule here, was this common knowledge in the county?" "No," Judge Garfield said. "It was not." "The county board was not informed of the terms," Evelyn said. "I've indicated the relevant section of the county water statute that requires disclosure of private contracts affecting public access. Section 14, paragraph 3. Crane found the section in the documents she'd provided. He read it. He took off his glasses and cleaned them and put them back on. "Mrs. Thorne," he said, "how long have you lived in Raven Creek?" 4 months, she said. He looked at her. He looked at the judge. He looked back at his papers. "I'll need to interview several of the East Fork farmers," he said. "And I'll need copies of these documents for the county record." "I have copies prepared," Evelyn said, and she produced them from the leather folder she'd brought, organized and labeled exactly as he would need them. Crane took the copies. He looked at them briefly. He said to no one in particular, "Well." That was all he said, but he said it in a way that meant considerably more than the word itself. The weeks between Crane's arrival and the hearing were not quiet, but they were not the tense waiting dark of the pre-storm period either. They were the different kind of busy that comes when a situation has turned, and the work to be done is institutional rather than personal. Letters, statements, formal records, the assembly of a documented case from the components that Evelyn had been building since the first week she arrived. She was efficient, and she was inexhaustible, and she made mistakes, which she corrected without drama and without the self-flagellation that some people use as a substitute for actually fixing things. She sent a letter to Crane's office with a calculation error and followed it the next day with a corrected version and a note that said, "Please discard the version sent on the 14th. The corrected figure is enclosed. No apology, no explanation beyond the necessary." Crane, in his response, noted the correction and confirmed receipt, and something in his reply suggested he found the directness refreshing. Caleb's forearm healed, not quickly and not completely. He suspected the bone had been cracked after all, despite what he'd said the night of the attack, and it would give him trouble in cold weather for the rest of his life. He told Evelyn this one evening when she asked how the grip felt on the heavy hammer, and she received the information with the same practical attention she gave everything. "Show me," she said. He demonstrated the grip. She watched his forearm, not his face. "You're compensating with the shoulder," she said. "You'll damage the shoulder if you keep doing it." "I know." "Then why are you doing it?" "Because the work needs doing." She looked at him with the particular expression she had for his stubbornness, not irritated exactly, but alert to it, watching it from the side. "Teach me the lighter work," she said. He looked at her. "What?" "The work you're doing with the weak grip," she said. "Teach me to do it, so you don't have to compensate." He started to say something about that not being necessary, and she looked at him steadily, and he recognized that he was about to make the same mistake that other people had been making about her since before he knew her, which was to assume she couldn't do a thing because no one had offered to teach her. "Come here then," he said. He spent 3 evenings showing her. She was not natural at it. Her instinct was to muscle through with strength where the technique required finesse, and he corrected that twice before she adjusted. But she was precise, and she paid attention, and she did not repeat errors, which in Caleb's experience was rarer than raw talent. By the 3rd evening, she could do the lighter rod work that had been straining his shoulder, And she did it with her sleeves rolled and the fire hot, and the kind of concentrated focus she brought to the account ledgers, and Caleb stood back and watched her and felt the quiet, compound satisfaction of a man watching someone he respects do something difficult well. Pete Walsh came in during the second evening and watched for a moment from the door. "She's doing it right," Pete said to Caleb, in the tone of a 19-year-old who feels his expertise has been validated. "She is," Caleb agreed. "She corrects fast," Pete said. "Yes." Pete nodded. He went back to the stable. That was high praise from Pete Walsh, who had strong opinions about horses and tools and very few opinions about people. The hearing was on a Wednesday. It was held at the courthouse, which was too small for the number of people who came, and the overflow stood outside in the cold and sent representatives inside to report what was said. Victor Hale sat at a table with two lawyers. He'd brought a second one from Denver, and he wore a dark suit and the expression of a man who intends to win a thing he has not yet conceded losing. Ed Coyle testified. He was quiet and specific, and he answered the questions without elaboration. And when Victor Hale's lawyer tried to establish that Coyle had motive to fabricate, Coyle said, "I didn't know these people before I came to this town. I've got no reason to do anything for them. I've got a reason to tell the truth, which is that I don't want to carry someone else's charge." Relly testified. He was less composed than Coyle and more frightened, and he got confused on two dates and had to be walked back to the correct sequence. But on the central fact, Victor Hale at the table saying before the Creek negotiations, "I don't care how," he was solid because it was true, and he remembered it. Aldous Crane from the county board testified on the water contract matter. He was precise and procedural and devastating in the way that precise procedural men can be when the facts cooperate. The arrangement between Hale and the Salida Company had not been disclosed to the county board as required. The fee structure, if applied to the East Fork access, would have constituted a prohibited private toll on public waterways. 3 separate sections of county statute had been violated. Nate Garrity testified about what his acreage depended on. Warren Elgay testified about the same. Evelyn was called to explain her documentation. She sat in the witness chair with her papers in her lap and answered each question directly and without ornamentation. And when Victor Hale's Denver lawyer asked her, with a particular kind of condescension in his tone, whether she had professional credentials in water law or accounting, she said, "No, I have arithmetic and public records. If either of those is wrong, point to where." He did not point to where. Caleb watched from the gallery. His arm ached. He had not slept well the night before, and he knew his face showed it, the scarring making whatever expression he wore look more severe than he intended, which was something he'd long since stopped apologizing for. The woman sitting beside him in the gallery, he didn't know her name. She was someone's wife, someone from the East Fork, leaned over at one point and said quietly, "Your wife doesn't let anyone push her around." "No," Caleb said. "She doesn't." The woman nodded. She looked at Evelyn in the witness chair. "Good," she said. The hearing did not conclude Victor Hale's legal situation. That would take months, 2 more hearings, and a case that eventually moved to the district court in Denver. But what it established on that Wednesday, in the too small courthouse in Raven Creek, was sufficient for the judge to order the immediate suspension of Hale's water contract pending review, and to set formal charges on the criminal matter that were substantially more serious than the initial arrest had named. Victor Hale left the courthouse without looking at anyone in the gallery. His lawyers walked close to him, and his face was the contained, dangerous face of a man revising a plan rather than abandoning one. He was not finished. He was going to be a problem that required continued management, but he was no longer the largest fact in the room. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had been standing in the cold moved and shifted and broke into conversations, and there was a quality to it, a collective exhale, a recalibration of what was possible, that Caleb had not felt in this town before. He stood on the courthouse steps and watched it, and didn't know what to do with his hands, which was unusual for a man whose hands were almost always occupied. Evelyn came out behind him. She stood on the step beside him and looked at the crowd. "He'll appeal," she said. "I know. The Denver court is going to be slower and messier than this. I know that too. She looked at the street, at the people in it, at the weak March sunlight coming off the snow. We're going to have to keep the documentation current, everything that happens from here. Yes. And the East Fork farmers need to file formally with the county board before the end of April. Evelyn? She stopped. It's done for today, he said. She looked at him. And then she did something he hadn't seen her do before. Not completely. She let her face go quiet. Not blank, not shut down. Quiet. The working surface of her, the cataloging and planning and managing, went still for just a moment. And what was underneath it was tired and relieved, and something else that she let him see without naming. Yes, she said, it's done for today. Pete Walsh appeared at the bottom of the steps, grinning with the uncomplicated joy of a 19-year-old whose side has won. He looked up at them both. They're talking about it already, Pete said. Everyone. You should hear what Nate Garrity just said about Mrs. Thorne. What did he say? Evelyn asked. Pete's grin widened. He said you're the best bookkeeper he never hired, and it was his loss. Caleb looked at his wife. Something moved through her face at this. Not vanity, nothing so simple as that. It was the particular expression of someone who has spent a great deal of their life being overlooked, and who finds, after a while, that being seen is almost more difficult to absorb than being passed over because you never prepared for it. She looked at Pete. Tell Mr. Garrity his horses are well shod, she said. Pete laughed. He went off down the street. Caleb and Evelyn stood on the courthouse steps in the thin March sun, and the town moved around them, and the water was still running through the lower creek where it always had, and the forge was still standing at the end of the road. Come on, Caleb said. Biscuit's been alone all morning. They walked home. Not side by side exactly. Closer than that, without discussion, through streets that didn't make room for them, so much as they no longer narrowed. And the difference was small enough that most people wouldn't have named it, but was felt by both of them in the way that small things are felt when you've been waiting for them long enough. Biscuit died on a Tuesday in early April. He had been slowing for weeks, slower than his usual slow, which had been considerable, and Caleb had known it the way you know things about an old animal you've lived alongside for years, a knowledge that lives in the body rather than the mind, and that you don't examine too closely because examining it doesn't change anything. The dog had stopped eating well in March. He slept more. He no longer raised his head when the forge door opened, which he had done every day for 15 years, an old habit of greeting that had outlasted his hearing and most of his sight. On that Tuesday morning, Caleb came in from the forge at midday, and Biscuit was on his blanket and he was gone. That simple, that quiet, the way a very old animal goes when it has simply decided it's done. Evelyn was at the table. She looked up when Caleb came in, and she read his face immediately. She came and stood beside him and looked at Biscuit on his blanket, and she didn't say anything, which was exactly right. She put her hand on Caleb's arm, the injured one, careful of it, and stood with him for a moment in the way of someone who understands that some things require presence and not words. After a while, Caleb said, He was 15. I know, she said. That's a good run for a dog. It is. He buried Biscuit in the corner of the forge yard that afternoon, in ground that was finally soft enough to work. Evelyn brought the blanket out, and he put it in with the dog, which she had not suggested and did not comment on. Pete Walsh came over without being asked and stood at a respectful distance while Caleb worked, which was the right thing to do, and Pete Walsh was, more often than not, the kind of person who did the right thing without being told. That evening, Caleb sat at the table and didn't eat much, and Evelyn ate quietly and didn't fill the silence, and at some point she got up and refilled his coffee without asking, and put it in front of him and went back to her side of the table. And he looked at the cup and then at her, and she was reading something and not looking at him, and the gesture was so practiced and so unperformed that it took him a moment to understand what it was. It was care, plain and unglamorous and real. He had not been on the receiving end of it for so long that he'd half convinced himself he didn't need it. Evelyn, he said. She looked up. He didn't have what he wanted to say organized into sentences. He was a man who worked in iron and not in words, and the feeling he was trying to reach for was larger and less cooperative than the sentences he had available. But she looked at him with those level brown eyes, and waited with the patience that was one of her particular qualities. The patience of someone who had learned that most important things took time to arrive and that hurrying them produced something lesser. "I'm glad you came," he said. It was what she'd said months ago, looking out the cabin window the first evening. He was returning it to her now with the weight of everything that had happened since. She looked at him for a long moment. "So am I," she said, and the way she said it was different from that first evening. Fuller, more settled, the words carrying more in them than words usually do. That was all. They sat at the table and the night came down and the forge yard was quiet, in the way it hadn't been for years, and Caleb felt the dog's absence as a specific, located grief that he did not try to minimize, because some things earn the weight you give them. The district court in Denver took Victor Hale's case in May. He had been on conditional release since April, which meant he was free to conduct business, but required to remain available and was prohibited from any contact with the Thorne property or with witnesses. His lawyers had filed 3 motions to reduce the charges and lost 2 of them. The third was pending. Caleb followed the legal proceedings the way he approached most things he couldn't directly control, with close attention and minimal comment. Evelyn followed them in considerably more detail, corresponding with Aldous Crane at the county board and with a woman lawyer in Denver named Margaret Forsyth, who had been recommended by Crane and who was the most direct correspondent Evelyn had encountered since her own letters, precise, unsparing about the likely difficulties, and apparently unconcerned with whether her directness was welcome. "She says the criminal case is strong, but the water contract case is complicated," Evelyn told Caleb one evening, with Forsyth's letter open on the table. "The statute violation is clear. The difficulty is establishing damages before the damages actually occurred, because Hale never completed the acquisition. So he failed, and therefore there's nothing to remedy," Caleb said. "That's the argument his lawyers are making." She turned the page. "Forsyth thinks the county board can pursue the undisclosed contract as a regulatory violation independent of the criminal charges. Different standard of proof, different venue." What does that mean practically? It means that even if the criminal case goes badly, which she doesn't think it will, the water arrangement gets unwound through the regulatory process. The contract with Salida gets voided. The fees he negotiated get renegotiated under county oversight. She put the letter down. It means it doesn't all depend on one outcome. Caleb looked at the letter, at the dense, careful paragraphs of Margaret Forsyth's hand. "You like her." "I respect her," Evelyn said, which was how she expressed liking when she was being precise. "Are you paying her?" "She's doing it for the county board, technically. The board is the affected party on the regulatory side." A pause. "But I've written to her personally twice, and she's written back each time, which is more than she has to do." Caleb thought about this. "She knows what you put together." "Crane forwarded everything," Evelyn said. There was a brief, controlled quality to the way she said it, the quality of someone who is not going to admit satisfaction outright, but is also not going to pretend it isn't there. "It was good work, Evelyn." She picked up the letter and folded it. "We're not done yet," she said, which was her way of keeping her feet on the ground, of not spending the outcome before it arrived. He had come to understand this as one of her particular disciplines. She did not celebrate in advance because she'd learned through the specific curriculum of a difficult life what it felt like when things you'd counted on didn't come through. He understood that curriculum personally. "No," he said, "but it was still good work." She put the letter in the correspondence folder and didn't say anything more, but the line of her shoulders when she turned away was a little different than it had been. The criminal hearing in Denver concluded in June. Caleb and Evelyn made the 2-day trip together, which was the first time either of them had been out of Raven Creek for purposes other than the immediate work of survival. They stayed in a boarding house that Forsyth had recommended, and Denver was loud and large and smelled of coal smoke and horses, and the particular density of a city that was still figuring out what it was going to be when it grew up. Evelyn looked at it with the cataloging attention she brought to new environments. She didn't say much, but she took in the city the way she took in everything, completely, storing it away. "Have you been here before?" Caleb asked, on the first evening, walking back from a restaurant where the food had been better than expected. "No," she said, Cincinnati was the biggest city I'd lived near, and I left it. She looked at the wide street, the electric lights that had been strung along the main boulevard. It's different from what I expected. Bigger? That and, she paused, more unfinished. I thought a city would feel more settled, but it's still working things out. Caleb looked at the city with her. Most things are, he said. She looked at him with the corner of her mouth turned, not quite a smile, but the thing that preceded it in Evelyn, the thing he'd learned to recognize as her particular version of warmth. Victor Hale was convicted on 2 of 3 counts, directing the destruction of private property, covered by Coyle's testimony and the coal oil can in the pipe that had come down on Caleb's arm, and fraud in connection with the water contract misrepresentation, which the district attorney had added in the final weeks when the county board's regulatory finding provided additional support. The 3rd count, the one his lawyers had argued was unprovable, the implied threat to Caleb's physical safety, was dismissed on insufficient evidence because that was Thorne's problem for being there, was in the end ambiguous enough under the law that the jury couldn't reach it unanimously. Victor Hale's lawyer had managed at least that much. Caleb sat in the courtroom gallery and heard the verdict read and felt something complicated move through him. Not triumph, because the outcome was partial and imperfect, and Victor Hale's face when the first 2 counts were read showed the contained, repositioning expression of a man who had already calculated that this was survivable. He was not going to prison for a long time. He was going to pay fines and potentially serve a shorter sentence, and then he was going to reorganize himself elsewhere, because men with money and a certain relationship to consequence always found a way to reorganize themselves elsewhere. But the water contract was void. The regulatory finding stood. The fees he'd negotiated would be renegotiated under county oversight, and the East Fork farmers would have access to the documentation to argue their terms. The Thorne property was clear and uncontested and registered and would stay that way. It was enough. It was not everything, and it was enough. On the walk back to the boarding house, Evelyn was quiet for several blocks. Caleb let her be quiet. Then she said, "He'll move on." "Yes. Find another town, another piece of land, another water arrangement." She said it without particular emotion. Men like that don't stop. They just redirect. I know. I used to think... She stopped, started again. When I was working at the laundry in Cincinnati, there was a man who managed the building. He did what Victor Hale did, on a smaller scale. Took what he could from people who couldn't push back. I used to think if someone would just stop him, if someone would just say no plainly enough and make it stick, he'd understand something. Did anyone stop him? Eventually, he overextended on something and lost the building. She paused. But he just moved to a smaller building. He didn't understand anything. He just had less room to operate. Caleb walked beside her. The city was still going around them, indifferent and busy. "So what do you do with that?" he said. "If they don't learn..." She thought about it for a long time, long enough that they'd walked another block before she answered. "You stop them anyway," she said, "not because it changes them, because it protects the people they were going to hurt next." She looked at the street ahead. "You do it for the people, not for the person." Caleb considered that. It settled in him somewhere true and solid. "I've been angry at Victor Hale for 4 years," he said, "at what he represented, at the kind of man who looks at someone else's livelihood and sees an obstacle." "I know." Standing in that courtroom today, when they read the first 2 counts, I thought I'd feel something large. I didn't. He looked at his hands. I felt tired. That's not the wrong thing to feel. It doesn't feel like winning. Winning would be him becoming a different person, she said. That didn't happen. What happened is we're still standing and he has less room. She glanced at him. I'll take that. He thought about what she'd said. You stopped them for the people, not for the person, and understood that this was Evelyn's particular kind of wisdom, the kind that came from a life of contending with things that couldn't be changed at their root and learning to work around them effectively. It was not a romantic view. It was not the view of someone who believed the world would improve if you confronted it squarely enough. It was the view of someone who had been confronting it squarely for 34 years and had arrived at a working arrangement with reality. He had been arriving at the same place from a different direction for 39 years, Perhaps that was what a marriage actually was when it worked. Not two people who saw things the same way, but two people whose different ways of seeing arrived, often enough, at the same useful conclusions. They went home the next day. The journey back was long and the coach was drafty, and Evelyn fell asleep against his shoulder somewhere in the second hour, and he sat very still so she could, which made his left arm ache progressively for the remaining 4 hours, and which he would do again without hesitation. Raven Creek looked smaller after Denver. It always did, Caleb figured, when you came back from somewhere larger. The familiar scale of things contracted around you and you had to readjust. But the smell of it was right, the mountain cold and the coal smoke and the particular mud and iron smell of the main street. And when the forge came into view at the end of the road, Caleb felt the loosening that happened when you were somewhere you belonged. He had not always felt that he belonged here. For most of the last 8 years, he'd felt like a man tolerated at the edge of a place, present but not included, doing his work and going home and not expecting more. The belonging he felt now was different. It had a different quality. Not the belonging of someone who'd been here longest, but the belonging of someone who had stood his ground and been stood beside and had built something that was visibly, concretely there. Evelyn stood in the forge yard and looked at the building, the walls she'd been inside of every day for 5 months, the lantern above the door, the anvil visible through the window, and he watched her look at it. "All right?" he asked. "Yes," she said. She said it simply, without qualification. Then she went inside to check the stove. Pete Walsh had been keeping the forge open in their absence, handling the lighter work and turning away anything too complex, and he had left a list on the bench of the orders that had come in. It was a longer list than Caleb expected. He stood at the bench and read through it and noted 3 new accounts. The Garrity Farm for ironwork on a new barn, Warren Elge's operation for tool repair, and a name he didn't recognize that turned out, when he asked Pete, to be a family that had moved to Raven Creek from the eastern slope in anticipation of the water situation being stabilized. "They said they heard things were being sorted out," Pete said. "They said the forge was part of why they came here." Caleb looked at the list. The forge. "You and Mrs. Thorne," Pete said with the directness of someone who didn't see any reason to be indirect about a fact. "They said there were people here who'd fought for the water rights and won. That's why they came." Caleb set the list down. He looked at the forge, the bellows, the anvil, the tool wall that he had built piece by piece over 11 years, the coals that Pete had banked correctly before leaving for the night. He had built this alone. For years he had maintained it alone, and the aloneness had become so habitual that he'd stopped noticing it had a weight. He noticed the absence of that weight now, the way you notice when a sound you'd grown accustomed to finally stops. Summer came to Raven Creek the way it always did, reluctantly and then all at once, the cold stepping back from the mountains over the course of 2 uncertain weeks, and then the warmth arriving solid and meant. The creek ran full from snowmelt, and the East Fork farmers had their first spring planting under the new water access arrangements, and the county board's oversight held, and there was no interference with the water flow. Victor Hale received a sentence of 14 months and a substantial fine, reduced from what the prosecution had asked for, and more than his lawyers had hoped to manage. He served 8 of the 14 months and was released in the following year and did not return to Raven Creek. What he did after that was other towns' problem, as Evelyn had predicted, and Caleb tried not to spend energy on it. Marsh remained in the county jail through the criminal case and was released 2 months after Victor with time served. He also did not return to Raven Creek. Ed Coyle's charge was dropped in exchange for his testimony, as had been the unofficial understanding, and he left for Wyoming and was not heard from again. The forge grew. Not overnight. Not in the way of stories that compress years into a paragraph and call it resolution. It grew the way real things grow, through accumulated work, through reputation built one well-done order at a time, through the kind of word of mouth that moves in a small community when people trust what they're saying. By late summer, Caleb had more work than he could manage alone, and he hired Pete Walsh formally, which Pete received with dignity and a slight reddening of the ears that he covered by immediately asking about the pay rate, which was fair, and which they both knew was fair, and which Pete accepted without bargaining. Evelyn managed the expanded accounts with the same method she'd applied to the original chaos, systematically, without drama, making it look like something any person with adequate attention could do, which was her particular genius and her particular modesty, because very few people could actually do it the way she did. She also continued the lighter forge work. Not every day, and not on the complex pieces, but regularly enough that it stopped being remarkable and became simply part of how the shop operated. People who came in for the first time sometimes registered surprise at seeing a woman at the bellows or the smaller anvil. People who had been coming for a while no longer noticed it particularly. Caleb noticed it. He noticed it every time, though he'd stopped showing that he noticed, because she didn't like to be watched with the particular attention of someone who finds her remarkable. She found it patronizing or adjacent to patronizing, and she had said so once, directly, which was how she handled things she found patronizing. What she didn't mind was being worked with, alongside, as a peer of the operation, which was what she was. In September, a woman named Ruth Cutter, wife of the sheep farmer who had come to Caleb after hearing from Warren Elgie, came to Evelyn with a question about her household accounts. She'd heard from Claire Alderman that Evelyn had a way of making sense of financial records that most people found impossible, and she wondered tentatively whether Evelyn might look at hers. Evelyn looked at them. She spent an afternoon at Ruth Cutter's kitchen table and identified 3 places where Ruth had been overcharged by the same dry goods supplier for 2 consecutive years, and she wrote the letter to the supplier on Ruth's behalf. And the supplier, confronted with documentation rather than complaint, refunded the difference. Word of this also traveled. By October, Evelyn had a small, informal, completely unauthorized practice of helping women in Raven Creek understand their household and farm accounts. She did it on Tuesday and Thursday afternoons, at the table in the cabin behind the forge, with whoever came. She did not charge for it, because charging would have made it a business, and she didn't want to manage another business. She did it because it was something she could do, and people needed it done. Caleb came in on a Thursday in October and found 3 women at his kitchen table with ledgers and papers spread between them, and Evelyn at the head of it explaining something about a tax assessment, in the level, plain voice she used when she was teaching something, and all 3 women listening with the focused attention of people receiving information long withheld. He stood in the doorway for a moment. Then he went back to the forge and let them work. That evening, after the women had gone and the table was cleared, he said, "You should charge something." Evelyn looked up from the dishes. "I shouldn't." "Why not?" "Because they won't come if it costs money. The women who need it most are the ones who can't spend on anything that isn't already justified to a husband." She said it without bitterness. It was just the terrain. If it's free, it's just a neighbor helping. That's allowed. He thought about this. That's not fair. No, she agreed. It isn't. She put the last dish away. Very few things are. He watched her move around the kitchen she'd taken over from his bachelor disaster of a kitchen and organized into something that actually functioned, and thought about the woman who had gotten off a train 5 months ago with a trunk and a firm handshake and the expression of someone who had made a decision and intended to stand by it. He thought about the letter she'd sent to Denver, the 4 pages she'd written in the middle of the night, the hammer she'd held in the forge when the men came, the way she'd sat in Ed Coyle's jail cell and talked to him like a human being until he told the truth, the way she'd sat in that Denver courtroom and come out the other side without pretending the verdict was more than it was. He thought about what she'd said on the walk back from the courthouse. You stop them for the people, not for the person, and understood that this was not just a position about Victor Hale. It was how she moved through the world, not looking for fairness, not expecting recognition, not waiting for things to be organized correctly before she acted, just identifying what needed doing and doing it with whatever she had. She had been doing it her whole life in a laundry in Cincinnati and in this forge, and at kitchen tables on Thursday afternoons, and almost nobody had noticed or said thank you, and she had kept doing it anyway. That was the kind of person she was. He wondered if he'd managed to be that kind of person. He thought he'd come closer since November than in the previous 39 years combined, and he was not sure whether that was the situation they'd been in or the person he'd been in it with, and he suspected the answer was that it didn't separate out cleanly, which was perhaps the point. "Evelyn," he said. She turned. He said, "I want to tell you something." She waited. "When I put that advertisement in the papers," he said, I wrote it the way I wrote it because I thought honesty was the only decent thing I had to offer, that a woman ought to know what she was agreeing to. He paused. I didn't expect that someone would answer and be... He stopped again. He was not good at this. He had never been good at this, and he knew it, and he kept going anyway. I didn't know that what I was asking for and what I needed were going to be two different things. She was still watching him. What I asked for was someone willing to try, he said. What I needed was someone who wouldn't stop. He held her gaze. I want you to know I understand the difference, and I don't know how to say the rest of it very well, but I want to try. Evelyn put the cloth she'd been holding down on the counter. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him, and she looked at him with the direct, undefended look that she gave to things she had decided to meet fully. Then try, she said quietly. He said, I love you. I think I have for a while, and I wasn't sure how to say it. She was quiet for a moment. In the silence, the wood stove ticked and the wind moved against the cabin wall, and the forge yard was dark outside the window. I know, she said. I've known. She reached up and put her hand against the scarred side of his face. The side people had flinched from for 8 years, the side he had taught himself not to think about. And she held it there with the same firm, unperforming grip she'd offered on the platform the day she arrived. I love you too. I've been waiting for you to get there. He put his hand over hers. They stood like that in the kitchen for a while, in the unglamorous and entirely sufficient way of two people who had arrived at something real by a hard road, and neither of them said anything more because nothing more needed to be said. Outside, the first snow of the new winter was beginning, light and tentative, the way it always started, testing the ground before committing. The forge coals were banked, the accounts were in order, the papers were with the judge, and the water was running clean through the lower creek, and the East Fork farmers had made their last filing with the county board before freeze-up. There was no biscuit on the blanket near the stove. That absence was still there and would always be there, a small, permanent grief that Caleb had learned to carry the way you carry the specific weight of things you loved and lost. Not lightly, but without being crushed by it. In the spring, Pete Walsh would ask, with elaborate casualness, whether there might be room in the forge yard for a dog, because his sister's dog had had a litter and there was one that nobody had claimed and that Pete thought might suit. Caleb would look at Evelyn, and Evelyn would say, to Pete, that she supposed they could find room and the puppy would arrive in April, ridiculous, an enormous pawed, and completely certain of its own importance, and it would go directly to the old saddle blanket near the forge and turn 3 times and lie down, as if it already knew. But that was spring. This was November, and the snow was beginning, and Caleb Thorne stood in his kitchen with his wife's hand against his face, and the thing that had been missing from his life for so long he'd stopped believing it existed was simply, quietly, there. He had been a man the town called a monster, and he had been lonely in the way of someone who has given up on the alternative, and he had written an honest letter to 3 newspapers and then waited without much hope. And Evelyn Hart had gotten off a train in a strange town with a trunk and a firm handshake, and had proceeded to understand his life better than anyone alive, and to stand in a dark forge with a hammer at her shoulder when it mattered, and to write 4 pages of documentation in the middle of the night, and to sit at kitchen tables on Thursday afternoons and give other women what had never been given her. None of it had been clean. None of it had been easy. The verdict had been partial, and Victor Hale had walked away from it more intact than he deserved, and the forearm would ache every winter, and Biscuit was gone, and the world did not particularly reorganize itself around the fact that 2 overlooked people had found each other and built something worth keeping. But the forge was standing, the accounts were current, the water ran clean, and in the morning there would be coffee on the stove before he was up. Some people spend their whole lives waiting to be chosen by a world that never gets around to it. What Caleb and Evelyn had learned, separately, painfully, and then together, was that belonging was not granted. It was made, with your hands, with your work, with the choice to stand your ground and let someone stand beside you. That was the whole of it. That was enough.